I'm going to demonstrate how to do a narrow hem. So this would be a narrow hem probably on the bottom of a shirt. It would not have a shirt tail curved hem. It would have just a straight hem across it. This piece of fabric that I'm using is actually torn right on the grain, so I know that it's a straight hem. The first line that I'm actually going to sew is going to be 1/4 of an inch towards the raw edge from my 3/4 inch hem. So this shirt, when finished, will be folded up. I'm gonna maybe see if my iron, which I have right here, I'm gonna press part of this up just so you can see. So I've got it pressed pretty much on that 3/4 inch line, or 1 inch line. So I'm going to sew a straight stitch, and I'm going to sew it 1/4 of an inch away from this line. So I've got my sewing machine set at about a 3. Just depends on your fabric and your preferences. 2.5 to 3 is about what I sew at. I'm going to put my foot pedal up a little higher here. I'm working standing up right now, so I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch away from this line. So hopefully you can see where I've got this line marked in pencil along here. 1/4 of an inch on my foot there's my center where my needle is going down, and the edge of my foot is 1/4 of an inch. You're going to want to take some measurements with a good ruler and make note of the width of your foot from the different needle positions. So I know when I'm stitching with the needle in the center that I come out with 1/4 of an inch away from any line. Okay, so I've now got, so you can see that my stitching line is 1/4 of an inch away from my actual pressing line that my hem is going to be pressed up at. So you can see that I have my stitching line stitched at 3/4 of an inch away. Now I'm actually going to take, and I want to press this so that the stitching line is being pressed towards the wrong side. Now I'm not doing this at 1/4 of an inch. I'm actually doing this at 1/8 of an inch. So you want, this is a very narrow hem. You may see it called a rolled hem. It's used mostly in sheer fabrics or any time you don't want to have a very large hem on the bottom. So make sure that you keep that pressed at about 1/8 of an inch. I'm just going to grab my ruler and double check that I'm keeping this at 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so I'm going to press all the way across here. Okay, so I've got this pressed all the way across. Now I'm going to take it to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew right on top of that stitch that first stitch that I just did. So you can see here that I've got there's my stitch. I'm lining it up. I never look at the needle when I sew. I keep my eye on where I want my fabric to go or my stitches to go and where my needle is coming down. So on my sewing machine, my foot here, I've got a groove in the middle of this particular presser foot. So I'm going to put my needle down, make sure that I've got it right in one of those stitches, and I'm going to keep my eye right here the whole time I'm stitching. You're going to take your time with it. Now it may slide off by a thread, but you're definitely going to have it pretty well dead on as you're stitching. And you don't have to do this in any big hurry. You do this nice and slow. And you'll notice if your mind wanders or your eyes wander, you'll all of a sudden realize you're not looking at that same spot, and you may have gone off your stitching line by a couple of threads or a millimeter. It's pretty easy to do. This definitely takes a lot of practice, but you will be happier with your seams and how straight they are and how much more control you have, especially with top stitching. You'll be a lot happier with it if you can learn to watch where your fabric is going into your presser foot rather than watching your needle. Okay, so I've gone all the way across here, so you can see that I've stitched on here. From the reverse side, there's only one row of stitching. Okay, this one pretty close. There's one or two spots where it's off just by a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to move this back again. Now I'm going to trim this excess fabric off. So I'm going to take a pair of scissors and I'm going to clip my threads there, and I'm going to trim this off as close to that row of stitching without cutting the row of stitching. So I'm cutting it like as close to that as I can get, trying very hard not to cut through those stitches. So you can see here that I have a very narrow hem. If your fabric wasn't gonna fray, you could leave it at this point. I don't recommend it. I recommend that we do one more turn. So I'm just going to keep cutting here all the way across. So there, I've got all the way across. I've cut my excess off. So now I have this narrow hem. Now I'm going to take and I'm going to press it one more time, and I want to make sure that the fold of my press butts right up against where I've trimmed it. Okay, so pressing, very important. You want to make sure that you press before you stitch. You want to make sure you press after your stitch. You'll be much happier with the look of your garment at the end. I'm just going to grab my clapper here because this fabric's pretty good, but you may have a fabric that has a little bit of difficulty holding a press. So this is the clapper that I use most of the time. You may have a smaller one. You may have a bigger one. Of course, now it's a little more awkward to get this flipped over. So I'm going to give it a good press. Because everything has been cut on the grain, I can almost give this a little tug and it will fold right where it wants. You see how I'm placing my clapper down over my seam? So I'm allowing the seam to penetrate into my fabric and form a nice sharp crease for me. It just makes it so much easier to even sew. You can actually sew with using a lot less pins, and you'll just be a lot happier in the end, especially if you do all of your pressing as you go. So I'm just gonna take that, press this down here. Okay, so now you see I've got my seam pressed up, and I'm pressed up to the seam line. You can just barely see some of the pencil lines in there, but they are kind of right on that stitching. So now I'm going to go back to my sewing machine again. Now you'll have to take a look at where your seam is actually coming here. Let's see if we can get this so you can see right into the machine here. So I may have to go and stitch a little bit above this stitching line. Otherwise, I'm going to be very close to the end, and my seam will tend to want to fold back on itself, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to just get this started. So I'm trying to sew now very close to the fold edge. And I didn't hold my threads, so everything's kind of going off a little bit on its own there. So now I'm not looking at that thread. I'm now guiding this center groove so that it's just coming over the top of the fold. And I'm going to take my time on this because I'm not really giving myself an awful lot of room here. If it slides off, it's going to miss stitching my hem up. So I'm stitching all the way across. So from the back side, you will see 2 rows of stitching on here. Not a problem. If you've got a fabric that's very stable, like a cotton, you can probably do that first row that we did of stitching. You can probably eliminate that and just make that an actual crease if you can give yourself a really good fold. So you will eliminate 1 row of stitching. But if you've got a chiffon or a georgette or something a little bit sheerer or very lightweight, then you're going to need a little bit extra. So you're going to want to stabilize each seam as you go. And another thing you have to really watch, I notice my machine is kind of trying to grab the hole that my needle is going in on my presser foot tends to want to suck the fabric in. So that's why I've got hands both back and front. Now on a seam that's going to have something joined to it or folded back, I don't back stitch at the beginning or the end if I don't have to. So there you go. You can see now how I've got a nice narrow hem. So on this side I've got 2 little rows, and they're pretty even. Almost looks like a little bit of a twin needle look from this side, but that's my nice straight rolled hem. Okay,